16 hot dogs, 16 days, and 16 stories. This is 16 for 16. I'm Mary Bowers, a Korean-American adoptee and competitive eater. I'm about to step onto the biggest stage in all of world sports, the Nathan's Famous Hot Dog Eating Contest at Coney Island, New York. And this time, I'm bringing some of my friends along the way to share their stories. Robyn returns along with Chae to talk about what we can do better when it comes to adoptees and mental health. Chae, you mentioned a little bit earlier that there are large chunks of your early childhood that you simply don't remember. And that, in kind of doing this work, a lot of those memories have started coming back and you've started processing. So I guess first question for Chae is, what has been that experience of kind of tapping into what you thought was forgotten or completely unavailable and then addressing it now? And then Robyn, kind of, why is this happening? So Chae.
I went to a situation or a parent that was quite abusive, which is something that isn't necessarily common, but isn't uncommon in our experiences. And for me, I also didn't have any photos of myself as a child for a long time. So being able to remember was quite difficult. What I have learned about myself now is that that not being able to remember some of these, a lot of my childhood really came from a place of our minds are beautiful, and in a sense that they cope in the way that it needs to cope. And I think for me, for a long time, it was very protective of myself not to remember some of the things that I had gone through. Over the last 6 months to a year, I have started to remember some of the things that I couldn't before, if not everything, especially sort of feelings and sort of snapshots. And a big part of that, and what I believe is that I've been able to get to this place because with trauma, it's being able to get yourself to a safe place to be able to remember and think about those moments without necessarily reliving that experience in the current moment, as if you were there, right? Which is incredibly difficult. I feel I was able to get to a place where I was able to hold myself safely at times, be able to not only intellectually or rationally understand that I'm not reliving that, but also know inherently in my body. I think that's an important place to be able to get to. You can intellectually tell yourself that you're safe now, and as you're trying to remember things or go through the process of healing. But if your body doesn't feel like you're safe enough to do that, then it doesn't matter what you're telling yourself intellectually. It's your body is protecting you still. So yeah, a big part of that, the work to try and remember, has come from that. And I think just one thing that comes to mind as I speak about this is that I keep coming back to the statistic that was presented in front of the National Assembly by some of the Korean researchers who had done some amazing work around sharing some of the statistics and studies around Korean adoption, both from the adoptees but also from the birth families. And one of the statistics came around 1 in 3 adopted people had experienced abuse in their adopted homes. That's another layer at times to some of the mental health challenges that adopted people might face. I think it's important that we're ensuring that adopted people not only go to safe homes, but also have the support post-adoption to make sure that they're doing okay, and just really inform them around some of the challenges that they're going to face, because it's the awareness that I feel that really helps in terms of being able to work through some of the mental health challenges that you might face.
Yeah, Chae, you brought up something that I love, the way that Prentice Hemphill, who's a really amazing somatics provider and practitioner here in the States, talks and defines trauma as the breakdown of our capacity and experiences to feel safety, belonging, and dignity. And when you talked about that safety piece, that's just so important, and why the therapeutic relational safety, that we know that the outcomes for how successful, if you will, or how much healing can happen in a therapy relationship is based on really the relationship that the client and the therapist have. That's going to really provide significant outcomes if that individual, the client, feels safety and this sense of safety. And I think, Chae, you speak to so much about how our nervous systems, for no fault of our own, but also, to protect us, we have these protective mechanisms or defense mechanisms that really serve a purpose when we suddenly, our brain is constantly scanning for safety or threat. And we've lived in kind of this hyper-vigilant state of threat or really being hyper aroused, right? Because of our surroundings, of being right at adoption, being separated and placed with complete strangers that don't even look like us, right? So, there's, again, reasons why our systems then will go into not feeling safe, even when we are in safe relationships, right? It's through that healing work, like you talked about, Chae, and I think EMDR, the eye movement, desensitization, reprocessing type of therapy can actually really help to support that reprocessing of different types of trauma, whether that's big trauma or smaller traumas or compounded traumas, but really helping provide a safe space to reprocess that in a way that sensations you're not kind of going back into that trauma and re-traumatize, but actually being able to kind of move through that in a different way and reprocess that in a different kind of way. So I think there's so many different ways to support our own healing, but also to speak to the fact that, and I'll speak for myself, I know that for me, one of my trauma responses is that I disassociate. And that's, I think, a common kind of thing that I notice, for anyone that's really experienced different types of compounded trauma, but really thinking of how that can you're present, but you're kind of checking out, if you will, right? So it can kind of then, in some ways, we're going to have kind of gaps in our memory or different ways in which we kind of it's a protective mechanism, but kind of detach from our body in some ways to protect ourselves, right? So I wanted to touch on that in terms of maybe for some folks, you might experience, a hard time remembering things or putting kind of a timeline together of things because of maybe disassociation or other trauma responses that have served a purpose. And so that's why, again, healing and doing it in maybe a therapeutic setting that can help kind of reintegrate and help you make sense of your story. It's about really how you make sense of your story. We know that that's important in the trauma work is really important.
In my case, I think my experience with trauma has been that the secondary trauma has been worse than the first. So the first layer would be like the event itself, that initial separation, all of those things that you're talking about, like the body memories, the cortisol. All of that was definitely trauma. But then there's the secondary layer that was missing. And I think that is why I struggle so much now, is because that's a really important piece, that we're able to get help and resources for the first trauma and that it's timely. So instead of having this acknowledged ability to process grief or even just like the physical impacts of what that initial trauma meant, I've now had decades of my life where there hasn't been a solution, there hasn't been resolution to the first trauma. And that compounds, like you mentioned the phrase compound trauma, like it's added layers upon layers upon layers to that initial trauma. And that secondary trauma, I think, was largely preventable.
There's so much, I think, now being talked about in terms of like there's PTSD, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder, and then really thinking about complex PTSD or CPTSD. And so just to clarify, that's not something that's recognized in our like DSM-5 that we kind of diagnosed, but I think that we're recognizing that there's complex compounded trauma over a timeline and time frame versus, again, we can think of adoption as that one event, that significant traumatic event. But yeah, there's additional trauma when we get on a plane at like 3 months old and are flying across with unknown humans to an unknown land, right? I mean, then you have racism, you have all of the different types of other types of really significant things that can also impact our bodies and our wellness. For many of us, it's intergenerational. We're talking like generations of trauma that are kind of being passed through our bodies, and that's some really deeper types of healing and work.
I'm glad that you mentioned intergenerational trauma, because I know, especially for the adoptees who have children, it comes up in conversations and it is something with a lasting impact. Either one of you heard the phrase "hun," like this concept of Like, I love words that don't have a direct translation to other languages, because I think it tells the most about culture and values. And so in Korea, there is this concept of kind of the collective trauma of the Korean people and the grief that comes with it, and that's captured in this concept of Han. Are either of you familiar with that? And what does it mean to you? Let's start with Chae. I see you smiling.
Yeah, I know Han is complex in terms of its meaning and its significance to different Koreans. I remember thinking to myself, yeah, that's inherently Korean, and I know what that sort of feels like for what that means to me. When you talk around that as a concept in Korea, I think then when we talk around community trauma, I think a big part of this process in healing through what's happened really does require a lot of coming together from different parties, right? I think the healing collectively, there's the half of the birth families, which is a huge aspect of the impact that's had on them, and unrecognized sort of trauma and grief, and I guess their sort of concept of harm. And then there's us as adopted people. There's the government systems in play that ultimately had the role systemically into everything that's happened, and the agencies and other actors as well. And when I think around healing through this, it's not just necessarily the families, it's the coming together of all of these different groups and communities to, I believe, really fully try to heal together as a culture and as a community, and acknowledge what's happened, accept that, that it has happened, and it's okay to grieve that, but also moving forward together, and hopefully healing through that together.
How about you, Robyn?
When I first learned of this concept, I just thought, oh my gosh, that's totally like, that is that implicit memory that like I felt like ancestors in my body, just like feeling that deep sorrow and grief and pain. And then I also had, I have this really great friend who's Korean American, and really helped me also kind of reframe and understand kind of the other side of Han too, which is really kind of this also manifestation of something really beautiful. I think of it, it's kind of like a pearl, right? And just like this pressure that we've experienced, but it can ultimately be really beautiful as well. And not to dismiss any of what has happened collectively as people, when we can mobilize and come together on something and really look for transformative justice and change, that we can actually create something really beautiful and really really empowering us to really also inspire, hopefully, other intercountry adoptees, that this is not just about us, this is about a global community. So I think Han, has really kind of taken on different, meaning to me, but I do see what we're doing here as really a part of our Han.
I was just thinking a little bit earlier today, when I first came back to Korea, I was like the dumb little happy puppy, like ready to romp through the flower fields. And then when I arrived at the field, it was just covered with manure. and then I thought, well, you know what? That's okay. Sometimes that's what is required to make things grow.
No mud, no lotus, right?
Robyn, I do have one more question for you. What are some of the things that we can do to take care of ourselves and to take care of each other through this whole process?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's amazing that we've formed this little, little chosen family, right, amongst ourselves, and the 16 of us, coming together under all of our own unique circumstances, but really finding support in that and getting to know all of you, and just globally across time zones and everything. Really, I think that's so important, is to be in community. We can't do this work in isolation. As humans, we need to be in a pack, and we need to be in community. So I think, really finding community, whatever that looks like, and finding if you have access to and can, I think the therapeutic support is so important, to always be doing our own work. I think if anything, also support groups are great. If that's something you can have access to, there's so many virtual that are happening these days. Those are remarkable spaces. And just listen and read. There's so much literature out there, and research, and really amazing podcasts out there that I know is really beneficial to a lot of the adoptees that I work with. And so I think that's really been transformative, and can be also really helpful in a time when it feel very isolated. So I think, just being in community is the big thing for me.
Right. Thank you both for joining me today. I think that is a good way to conclude, kind of with this hopeful action that we can all take moving forward. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's good to see you both.